buoyancy is one of those skills that you can't really learn from a book. You can probably do quite well assembling kit and sort of regulator recovery type skills from some decent book reading, but buoyancy control is just one of those things that you just learn by doing. So neutral buoyancy is a balancing act between the negative sinky stuff like your lead weight and your torch and just anything that will sink basically, all added up, and then you have the positive floaty stuff like your body itself, and your wetsuit and your BCD or buoyancy control device basically makes up the difference to balance it. Buoyancy is all to do with the weight of the water that you displace. If you imagine the amount of space that you and all of your dive gear takes up and then fill that up with water, if all of that water weighs the same amount as you and your gear, then you're going to be neutrally buoyant. Pretty much. If you inhale or inflate your BCD, then you take up more space, but your weight hasn't changed, so now displacing more water, and the water that you've displaced weighs more than you, so you float, and that's kind of how buoyancy works, basically. So back in the day, old school divers didn't have BCDs, so they had to sort out their weights perfectly to be neutrally buoyant. But the invention of the BCD makes your life a lot easier. It also allows for all of your gear that changes buoyancy during the dive, but I will talk about that later. There is plenty of advice on how to improve your buoyancy, and most of it works, to be honest, but probably the best advice is to just go diving more. The more time you spend in the water, the more your body will learn what's actually going on in the water, and you'll be a better diver. So sign up to a local club or a dive trip or something so that you can get into the water more often than just once a year. By being in the water more often, then you'll relax more into it, and in turn will help your buoyancy because you've done it 100 times. The only thing that changes is the scenery. Shallow water is where most of the extreme buoyancy changes occur, so if you can practice there, then that's really the best place. So let's take a look at how to improve your buoyancy. The best way to improve your buoyancy is at the end of a dive to do a proper buoyancy check. Most divers are taught to do a buoyancy check at the beginning of a dive so that they float at a certain level with an empty BCD, but the best time to do a buoyancy check is at the end of a dive with a near empty tank. At the end of a dive, or if you have access to a tank with something like 50 bar or 500 psi or so in it, you want to dump all of the gas out of your BCD and your dry suit and see if you can hover just under the surface. If you can, perfect. If you find yourself sinking, then you're wearing too much lead, so it's obviously best to do this in shallow water. I probably should have said that at first. Make sure you don't plummet down to the murky depths, but take off small amounts of lead until you stop sinking. Full tanks are less buoyant, and you shouldn't be ending dives with anything less than 30 bar really, so if you can stay under with the amount of lead that you have left on your weight belt, then that is all the lead you should really need. Right at the end of the dive is going to be when you're at your most positively buoyant, unless you've been picking stuff up. So if you can stay down just under the surface with what little lead you have left, is probably the most lead you should really have on a dive. With less lead on your belt, you won't need to adjust your buoyancy as much during a dive, which is the true point of this exercise. You won't have an excess volume of gas on your back compensating for the extra lead that you're carrying. That gas changes volume and its buoyancy as you ascend and descend in the water, so cut away any excess weight because it's actually ruining your buoyancy and your air consumption. At most, you only want to be using a tiny amount of gas to adjust your buoyancy at depth, if any. Just take a look at your dive guide or your instructor and how little they actually touch their inflator during a dive. Once you've got the correct amount of lead on your weight belt, you need to put it in the right place. This is where a buddy comes in handy. Book some time out with your buddy in the water where you are both kitted up and try to hover in the horizontal position. Now, don't move or try to correct your position, just let your body turn whichever way it does. Sometimes sort of closing your eyes helps, but of course make sure you're in a safe environment and that your body can stop you from turning turtle or anything dangerous. So your buddy will be able to see exactly what's going on, and then together you can move some lead where it needs to go, usually back on the surface where it's safe to do so, and then that will get you a better position in the water. All of your lead on a weight belt is convenient, but that may put you in a head-up position. If so, then take some lead off of your weight belt and put it closer to your shoulders, either in trim weight pockets or on your cam band, or if you can, actually on your shoulder straps themselves, and this will hopefully bring your shoulders down so that you're flat in the water. Others tend to have floaty legs, and that's why we have stuff like ankle weights. The amount of lead on you doesn't change, but where it is in relation to your center of buoyancy does. So if you don't need that much negative weight on your feet, as with ankle weights, then maybe consider a heavier pair of fins. Some manufacturers are actually measuring their fins' buoyancy, so you can better decide if they're for you or not. Once you and your buddy have spent a while sorting out your trim, your buoyancy will improve as well because you can relax on a dive, not having to constantly fight to stay in the same position or swimming diagonally with your feet down. That actually increases your drag because you're constantly swimming against just more water, and you're also swimming upwards a little bit, so you swim in this kind of zigzag pattern, constantly adjusting your depth. There's a reason why tech divers and more advanced divers dive wing-style BCDs, and other than the customizability, it's the buoyancy characteristics. Wings have all of the positive buoyancy on your back around your tank, and they hold you in a great horizontal position when they have gas in them. One of the biggest complaints about wing-style BCDs from divers is that they put you in a face-down position on the surface when fully inflated, which is kind of what they're designed to do, so it's not really a design flaw. If you do, then just deflate your wing a little bit and you'll float upright. It's fine. If you need a fully inflated wing just to stay on the surface, then go back to the first point. You're just wearing too much lead. Wings also don't tend to trap air because they're just a round donut shape. Jacket-style BCDs have pesky pockets and sections that can trap air when you're in a certain position. You don't want trapped air anywhere on you, and when you're ascending, you want to be able to get rid of it quickly if you need to. Wings allow for this because all of the air is all basically on the same level, so you can purge it easily. At worst, you may need to dip your right shoulder or kind of look up a bit so the air migrates to your left shoulder, but a jacket may need a squeeze and a jiggle and a shuffle to get the gas to the right spot. Wings also tend to be pretty minimalist, so you don't have all this excess material of unknown buoyancy all over it. You get the material of the bladder itself, the straps, the backplate if you're using one, and any bits and bobs that you choose like D-rings. The more stuff that you load onto yourself for a dive, the more it will affect your buoyancy, so take it easy, and if you don't need it, don't bring it. If you dive with special stuff like a camera rig, then try to weight it properly instead of yourself. Don't be trying to hold on to this buoyant thing down with your weight belt or trying to drag this really heavy thing around. Try to make that thing as neutrally buoyant as possible so you don't need to worry about it pulling you around. Unless it's a DPV, that's what DPVs are supposed to do. Just make it neutrally buoyant. This is the tricky bit. As you learnt in your introductory course, as you swim down, the pressure increases and the gas volume reduces in a given airspace. The balloon basically gets smaller as you swim down deeper. If you're wearing a wetsuit or a dry suit, then those airspaces shrink down as the pressure increases. The amount of water they displace changes too, which changes your buoyancy. Also consider how good your wetsuit seals are. It can actually take a few minutes for all of the air that's trapped inside of your wetsuit lining to actually bubble out. It may not be much, but it might be enough just to skew your buoyancy a little bit, so check at the beginning of a dive. Buoyancy is all to do with the weight of the water that you displace, as I said earlier, and that's why we get runaway ascents and also runaway descents. As you ascend, the trapped air in your wetsuit and BCD expand, so they displace more water, so they become more buoyant, so you float more, so you go it just gets worse and worse until you reach the surface. If you have tons of air in your BCD at depth, it's going to increase in size more than if you only have a tiny amount of air in your BCD. Putting numbers to it, for example, if you're at 10 meters or 33 feet with, say, 1 ounce of air in your BCD, and you ascend to the surface, then you'll end up with 2 ounces. If you start off with 2 ounces at depth, then you'll end up with 4. So you want as little excess airspace on you during your dive as possible. If we could find a better alternative to wet or dry suits, then we'd definitely switch to it, but air and argon is just too darn insulating. Your tank is another one that most divers don't really realize changes buoyancy during a dive. Steel tanks sink when empty and full, but there is a ever so slight difference in its buoyancy. The difference is more obvious in some alley tanks because they can go literally from negative buoyancy when full to positive buoyancy when empty. And that's because the weight of the compressed gas inside is changing. Not by much, but enough to change the buoyancy during the dive. That's why we do that buoyancy check at the beginning of this video with an empty tank. Most of my logbook pages cover the gear I'm wearing, where I am, and how much lead I have, and how my buoyancy was on that dive. I remember my dives and the amazing things that I've seen, but the main reason I look back at old dive logs is to check out how much lead I should put on my weight belt. If you put all of this work into correcting your weighting, then you might as well log it correctly and include everything you can. All of the kit that you're wearing, where you were, what type of tank you were using, what type of suit, because it's all going to affect your buoyancy, and if you've dived something similar beforehand, then that's a good starting point for your next dive. Whenever I dive somewhere new, I look at the kit that I'm going to be using and I look up a similar dive and I work out my weighting from there. That way I know, for example, that on side mount I tend to be light on my shoulders, so I move a bit of lead up to my shoulders. I'll only need a couple of kilos of lead in salt water in a rash vest. So without logging these kind of details, it's easy to forget and you just end up sort of overweighting yourself, and it just saves a lot of faffing around on dive 1 when you can just go diving. So there were a few of my tips on better buoyancy, but the trick is to just relax and just go scuba diving more, to be honest. Use your lungs before your BCD, and most people dive too much lead. If you inflate your BCD longer than that to get neutrally buoyant at depth, then you've probably got too much lead. But what tips do you have? Let us know in the comments below, and stay tuned on the channel for some more videos to help you make a better diver. Thanks for watching, and safe diving. People don't really consider these things when they're diving. Granted, one of them is taught pretty thoroughly in your dive course, but the others are arguably just as important, but they are all kind of focused on your decompression basically, and just staying safe, to be honest. So let's take a look at 5 things you shouldn't do after a dive.